So the first technique that I'm going to do is a flat wash, where I'm going to neatly paint my area with a flat wash of color evenly. So for this I need my clean water. I'm going to fill up my brush with enough water, and then I'm going to pick a color of my choice. I'm just picking a red color, and I have enough. And then I'm just going to go neatly throughout with the even layer of paint. Now if you want it darker, you need to have more paint and a little less water. And also remember that when watercolor dries, it's gonna dry lighter, so it's always better to give it or make it a little darker than you want it to. So this is like a flat, even range of color. So this is my flat wash. Now I'm gonna let it dry now. So for my next thing, I'm gonna do a gradient where I'm going to start light, and then I'm going to make it darker as I go down. So for making it darker, you need to add more paint every time. So I'm gonna add more. And then I'm going to add a bit more paint. And then for the last layer, I'm going to make it really dark. A little more. Just going to lighten it slightly. Then this part is going to be even. To make any area light, if you add water, it gets lighter. So this is my gradient wash. You can see that I have almost 3 colors. So this is dark, and then this is a little medium, and then right on the top it's really light. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to blend some colors. So I am going to start with a yellow this time. And then in between I'm going to add some green, yellow green. So because it's wet, it's going to blend. If I do it once the paint dries, it's not going to blend so much. Then I'm going to do a darker green. And then maybe a nice blue. This one is a blended color. So these are the three basic things that we can do, especially for big areas. We can create a flat, simple, flat, clean paint, or I can do a gradient where I go lighter to darker, and then I could also do a blended look. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to apply wet paint on a wet surface of paper. So I'm going to get some clean water, put it on the paper, make sure that it's wet. And then while it's wet, I'm going to pick up some paint. Let's see. I'm going to get a purple. Make sure that it's wet, it has water. And then I'm just going to blot on that. And I can add different colors too, so maybe I'll go with a different blue. Just putting it creates a this is like an ambiguous look. You don't know how the paint is going to spread. I'm actually going to go add another color. It's a little wet. That's my wet paint on wet paper look. Next I am going to do a glaze. So when I'm doing a glaze, this is like a two-step process. I am going to apply some paint and make sure that it is totally dry before I move on to the next step. So I'm just going to apply some paint and then wait for it to dry. I'm going to do a flat wash yellow. Now I'm going to wait for this to totally dry before I do my next step. I'm thinking I'm going to make it a little more dark, so giving it a second coat. Now I'm just going to leave this, make sure that it is drying. So while we are waiting for that, let's actually move on to the next thing, which is my dry brush. So as the name suggests, you don't need water. The brush is dry and the paint is just enough wet so that I can still pick up that, because if the cake is totally dry, cannot pick up the paint. So I'm just gonna pick it up from here. This is a different brush, this is dry, and I'm going to try and so see, this is very dry, so I might need to wet my cake a little more. Yes, this works. maybe I can change colors and add another color with it. So I'm gonna add some dark green to it. This creates kind of a rough texture that might look good when you're making grass. There, I have my dry brush. I think this is still wet. So next thing, I'm going to do a crayon or oil pastel resist, which we do a lot. And I really like mixed media painting, so we can do oil pastel painting and cover the big areas with watercolors. So let's try to do that. So I have my yellow oil pastel and I'm going to just draw a big sun maybe. And then I'm going to use a clean brush and I'm going to use my orange and then go on top of it. A little lighter. Could even just pick up some extra water that goes on top of the oil pastel. And there. You can add a little bit of different colors maybe around it. As you can see, once the paint dries, you can see that the crayon, because it does not mix with the oil pastel, it stands out separately, and then it has a blended look around it with the watercolors. So next thing that we are going to do is, let's see if it has dried. So when you touch, it might feel dry, but if it is still cold, I would wait a little more until it's totally dry. So we'll get back to this later. Next, let's come to our negative painting. So negative painting is when you don't color the object, instead you're going to color everything around it. So let's see how to do that. I'm going to draw a leaf and then, or maybe actually I'm going to create a light flat wash first. So I'm just gonna create a light flat wash. And then let it dry first, and then I'll do my negative painting on top of that. Okay, I think this looks good. Now I'm just gonna let it dry before I move on to the next step. So I feel like now this is dry. So for the glaze, what I'm going to do is this is totally dry, and then on top of it you're going to apply a second layer of paint. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some paint of my choice. And then I'm just gonna go another line. You don't want the paint to spread, so it has to be very dry before you do this step. Maybe a different color. Let's try with a different color. I'm gonna add a red this side. I can even write something. I'm gonna write my name. So this only works where if the background is dry. If it's not dry, it's gonna spread the paint and it's gonna create a wet look like what we did here. So now that's done, and then let's come back to our negative painting. This is totally dry. So now it's ready for us to do a little drawing on top of it. I'm gonna just draw a leaf lightly. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to color the negative areas. So this is going to include the background, and then maybe I'll also color this vein inside. So I'll choose yellow, and then I'm gonna as I go further, maybe I'm gonna make this a little more darker, adding a bit of brown to make this darker. I'm also going to color the inside of the vein here. You can add more paint, make it darker as we go outward. That gives it a nice look. And here we have a leaf, by actually not coloring the leaf but the area around it. So that's why this is called a negative painting. So that's there. See, as this dries, the oil pastel resist starts looking better and better once it dries. So next I'm going to do blotting, which is simple. I'll be applying wet paint maybe on a wet surface, and then I'll use a tissue to pick up some areas. So I am filling my brush up with water. Then I'm going to add some color of my choice. I'm just gonna quickly pull this up, and you gotta pick this up before everything dries, so you gotta be quick. If you're not quick, that's not gonna work. I think I'm gonna create a look where there's a blend of different colors. And once before it's dry, I'm just going to use my tissue to pick up some paint here and there. And that creates a different look too. The final thing that we are going to do is create a splatter. So for this, I'm gonna have two brushes, one filled up with paint and the other one so that I can just tap on top to create a splattered look. So I'm going to wet my brush and fill it up with paint. I'm gonna use a green. And then carefully I'm gonna tap it. I'm going to change my colors. I use a different color on top of it. Purple, it's all wet. This looks great if you're doing something like a galaxy. I should have covered up the top before I did that, but anyways. And then I'm going to maybe add a bit of yellow as well. And that's a splattered look. So we created 10 easy techniques that we can use to make interesting paintings using watercolors. The first one was a flat wash where you just color it out neatly. The second one was gradient where it's the same color but you can see dark and light. The third one similar to this but with different colors. So it has to be wet, and you are applying the second layer of color before the first layer dries so that it blends, the water makes it blend. This one is pretty too. So I wet my paper with water first, and then I picked up my wet paint and then just blotted it here and there. And because everything is wet, the water makes the paint spread, and it is kind of ambiguous, kind of random, so it's very fun. This one needs patience. This is the glazed look where I am going to apply paint on dry surface. So I had my first coating, let it dry totally before I went and drew something on top of it. This is dry brush where you have your paint just enough wet so that you can still pick up the color, but your brush is totally dry. And when you do that, it creates this dry and rough look. This is crayon resist, where you have the first layer applied with a crayon, and the crayon actually does not blend with the watercolor. So once it dries, this is going to stand out, and then you will have a nice background around it. This was my negative painting. You could do more complicated ones. So where I did a base, very light base, and then I let it dry. Then I drew something on top, but I did not color what I drew, but I colored around it. I colored the negative space. This is blotting, where I have wet paint. I applied wet paint and quickly used my tissue to blot out some areas to create a nice look. This would look beautiful on a sky. Then this is splatter, where I picked up paint on one of my brushes with enough water and then just tapped onto it with another brush to create a splattered paint for something like a galaxy. So we learned 10 simple things, and I hope you all try this at home and let me know how it went. See you next time. Bye.